Hey guys, tonight I want you to do the usual. Dim the lights, maybe turn your phone face down. Let the room get a little softer around the edges. If you've got a blanket nearby, go ahead and claim it. We are heading somewhere cold. Not metaphorically cold, not emotionally distant royal father cold. I mean actually cold. Siberian cold. The kind of cold that makes your eyebrows consider early retirement. So just settle in. Breathe slow. Let your shoulders drop. Tonight's story drifts to the edge of the Russian wilderness, to a small village that barely registers on most maps, and to one elderly woman who absolutely did not plan to become a temporary bear mother. But life, as it so often does in history, had other ideas. We're floating over to Siberia, specifically a stretch of land not terribly far from regions like Yakutsk and the infamous cold pocket of Oymyakon, places where winter temperatures drop so low that thermometers just give up. -40, -50, on special occasions -60, because why not double down? The air there doesn't simply feel cold, it feels structural, solid, like you could lean against it. Our story begins in late winter, that strange Siberian season when the sun technically returns, but warmth does not. Snow lies in thick, undisturbed blankets across the forest floor. Trees stand stiff and silver. The sky is pale and endless. And in a small wooden house at the edge of a forest clearing lived an elderly woman named Valentina. She was in her late 70s, possibly early 80s. In Siberia, ages blur a little because everyone looks weathered in the same sturdy way. She had lived in that house for decades. The house had a wood-burning stove, a narrow bed, lace curtains that had seen better centuries, and a kettle that was almost always on. Her life was quiet, predictable. She chopped wood, she boiled potatoes, she listened to the radio when it worked, she fed the occasional stray cat. She had survived the Soviet-era economic collapses and the kind of winters that turned lesser souls into indoor philosophers. She did not, at any point, wake up and think, today feels like a good day to adopt a bear. But out in the forest, something else was happening. A mother bear had denned for the winter, as they do. In Siberia, brown bears, specifically the Eurasian brown bear, prepare carefully for hibernation. They dig deep dens, they curl into themselves, they trust that spring will eventually come. This particular mother bear had given birth during hibernation, which sounds dramatic, but for bears it's just Tuesday. Cubs are born tiny, blind, barely the size of a small loaf of bread, entirely dependent. Normally, everything proceeds with quiet, biological precision. But this winter had been especially brutal. Snow fell early, deep. Then came a sharp freeze, then more snow, then a wind that cut through the forest like an impatient landlord. Something went wrong in that den. Perhaps the mother bear was undernourished. Perhaps the den partially collapsed. Perhaps instinct met miscalculation. We don't get a dramatic soundtrack explaining it. Nature rarely narrates. What we do know is that one of the cubs did not remain safely tucked in the den. Instead, days later, a small shape moved weakly across the snow. A cub, alone, shivering, driven by instinct more than understanding. Now, imagine that for a moment. A creature that should still be in darkness, following scent, following warmth, following anything. And what it eventually found was smoke. Smoke curling from the chimney of Valentina's small wooden house. Inside, Valentina was doing what she always did, tending the stove, rearranging logs, watching the faint frost patterns on the window glass, perhaps muttering about the price of flour. It was an ordinary day in extraordinary cold. Then came the sound. Not a roar, not a dramatic growl, just a faint, desperate scratching at the door. Now, if you live in Siberia and you hear scratching at your door, you do not immediately assume adorable woodland visitor. You assume something with teeth, possibly something large, possibly something that outweighs you by several 100 pounds. Valentina paused. The scratching came again, weak, uneven. She shuffled toward the door, slowly, because she was elderly, and also because caution is deeply embedded in anyone who shares land with bears. She opened it a crack, and there in the snow was not a monstrous predator, not a fully grown bear with territorial ambitions, just a cub, small, frost clinging to its fur, eyes barely open, trembling so violently it seemed more vibration than animal. For a long moment, the two simply looked at each other. And here is where history does something very quiet. It pauses. It waits to see what a human being will do. Valentina could have closed the door. That would have been sensible. Bears grow, cubs have mothers, and mother bears are not known for polite conversation. But she did not close the door. She opened it wider. The cub tried to step forward and stumbled. Its tiny paws slid on packed snow. It made a soft sound, not a roar, more of a tired whimper. Valentina sighed, because of course this would happen. Of course, after 70-something years of hard winters and careful routines, she would now be negotiating with a half-frozen baby bear. She bent down, slowly, joints protesting. She wrapped the cub in an old wool blanket. The cub did not resist. It did not have the energy for dramatic wildlife gestures. And she brought it inside. The door closed against the Siberian wind. Inside, warmth. Relative warmth, at least. The stove glowed. The air smelled of wood smoke and boiled cabbage. Valentina placed the cub near the stove, but not too close. She had grown up around animals. She knew enough not to shock a frozen body with too much heat too quickly. The cub lay there, shivering, small breaths puffing in the warm air. Now this is the part where some stories become loud, heroic music swells, the elderly woman becomes a saint of the forest.
But we're not doing that tonight. Instead, picture an old woman muttering under her breath as she warms milk on the stove. Because yes, she decided milk was appropriate. She had goats once. She knew about feeding fragile things. She found an old bottle, possibly from years ago, possibly repurposed. She filled it carefully. The cub did not understand glass bottles, but it understood warmth. It understood scent. It latched on. And in that small kitchen, in the deep Siberian winter, a rhythm formed. Slow, quiet, breath in, breath out, milk swallowed. Valentina sat on a wooden chair and watched. Now here's the delicate problem. Where there is a cub, there is usually a mother, and mother bears in Siberia are not casual about their offspring. They are protective in a way that makes medieval queens look emotionally detached. Valentina knew this, so she waited. The next day, she stepped outside cautiously. She scanned the tree line. Snow sparkled in hard light, no movement. She listened, nothing but wind. The cub remained inside. It slept, it ate, it whimpered occasionally in confused dreams. Day 2 passed, no sign of the mother. Valentina began to worry in a practical way. Bears grow quickly. This was not a kitten she could simply keep by the stove indefinitely. It would, at some point, become a very large roommate. But the cub was still fragile, too weak to survive outside, too small to defend itself. So she made a decision. She would care for it temporarily. Temporarily in Siberia can mean many things. Days stretched into a week. The cub grew stronger. Its fur fluffed slightly. It began to explore the small kitchen, wobbling from table leg to stove corner. Valentina moved breakable items higher because she was elderly, not foolish. At night, the cub slept in a wooden crate lined with blankets. It would occasionally attempt to climb out, not successfully. Yet. She named it Mishka, because in Russia, many bears become Mishka. It's almost contractual. Outside, the forest remains still. Deep winter does not rush. Villagers eventually noticed something unusual. Valentina's door opened and closed more frequently. Strange paw prints appeared in snow near her steps. One neighbor, bundled in layers that made him resemble an ambulatory mattress, approached cautiously. He knocked. Valentina opened the door just enough to peer out. "Do you have a bear?" he asked. Now this is not a sentence most people expect to hear in casual conversation, but in Siberia it's oddly plausible. She paused, considered, then shrugged. "A small one," she said. He stared. She stepped aside slightly, and there behind her, Mishka waddled across the floor, bumping gently into a chair leg. The neighbor blinked several times. Because this is how rural legends begin, not with drama, just with bewildered men in oversized coats. Word spread quietly. The old woman had a bear cub in her kitchen, near the stove. Some villagers disapproved. Bears are wild, dangerous, unpredictable. Others were secretly delighted, because in a place where winter stretches endlessly, a bear cub is at least something to talk about. Eventually, local wildlife officials were informed, not in a dramatic, flashing lights way, more in a cautious, perhaps someone should look into this manner. 2 officials arrived days later. Their truck groaned across frozen ground. They wore expressions that suggested paperwork awaited them somewhere warmer. They knocked. Valentina opened the door just enough to peer out. Inside, Mishka had grown visibly stronger. He stood on unsteady legs and regarded the newcomers with vague curiosity. The officials removed their hats. They assessed the situation. Yes, it was a bear. Yes, it was indoors. Yes, the elderly woman seemed oddly calm about it. They discussed options. Returning the cub to the wild immediately would likely mean death. It had missed crucial bonding time. It had grown used to human warmth. Taking it to a rehabilitation center would be possible. There were facilities near larger towns, far from here, near cities like Yakutsk, where wildlife programs occasionally handled orphaned animals. Valentina listened. She did not argue. She understood. But she asked one thing. "Wait until spring," she said. "Let him get stronger." The officials hesitated. Then, perhaps influenced by the sight of the cub gently chewing on a stove leg, they agreed, temporarily. And so, winter continued. Days softened slightly. Sunlight lingered longer in the afternoons. Snow began to crust differently underfoot. Mishka grew. He began testing boundaries, climbing onto benches, investigating cupboards, attempting to steal bread with surprising coordination. Valentina adapted. She scolded him mildly. He blinked at her. Occasionally he complied. Occasionally he did not, because bear. At night he would settle near the stove, enormous paws twitching in sleep. There was something profoundly quiet about it. An old woman and a young bear sharing space against a brutal climate. No speeches, no headlines, just survival. Spring eventually began its slow arrival. The forest shifted. Snow thinned differently. Water dripped steadily from eaves. And one morning, wildlife officials returned. This time, Mishka was no longer loaf-sized. He was sturdy, strong, curious. He would need space, forest, instinct. Valentina stood at her doorway as they gently secured him in a transport crate. He made small, confused sounds, not frightened exactly, just uncertain. She reached through the crate slats and touched his fur one last time, because she knew something about letting go. Siberian winters teach that, too. The truck drove away slowly. The clearing returned to quiet. Inside, the stove still burned. The kettle still hummed. The chair near the window remained slightly scuffed from small claws. Valentina closed the door. She adjusted the wood in the stove. and life resumed its familiar rhythm. Some months later, reports came from a rehabilitation center near Yakutsk. The cub, Mishka, had adapted well. He was learning to forage, to climb, to avoid humans. Eventually, he would be released into a protected forest area far from villages. Valentina received word through neighbors. She nodded once. "Good," she said, because that was always the goal. Not to keep him, just to help him survive long enough to choose his own wilderness. And so, as we let this first part drift to a close, picture that small house in the vast Siberian landscape. Snow melting, smoke rising gently from the chimney. Inside, an elderly woman pours tea into a chipped cup. Outside, somewhere deep in the forest, a young bear moves between trees, strong now, independent, entirely unaware that for a fragile winter he slept beside a stove and drank milk from a bottle. History does not always roar. Sometimes it just scratches quietly at the door.